Hi, welcome to the Deep End Games board gaming podcast, where we take a look at the deeper end of the board gaming hobby. Today, we are interviewing Cole Wehrle, who is a designer who is very famous for some of his designs that have been recently coming out. The most notable of which has been Pax Pamir, but which has been followed up by an infamous Traffic, and also a very exciting game that's coming out later this year that I am extremely excited about, and that's John Company. And so we have Cole Wehrle here, and we're going to just talk to him a little bit about his designs and some of what led him into getting involved in game design. So Cole, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on, Joe.
Oh, no problem. So I kind of want to start out these interviews just kind of getting to know the person that we're interviewing. But the one thing that I always try to start out with is just kind of what led you into the board gaming hobby. It's kind of something that just not everybody kind of gets involved with and kind of just falls into. What kind of led you to just wake up one day and find yourself kind of involved in this kind of niche hobby board gaming?
I feel like I got started younger than a lot of the people I meet who are in the hobby. We played a lot of games at my house growing up. I had 4 younger siblings. We were all taught chess very young. We played a lot of Risk and Stratego. And then it must have been in late elementary school, someone gave me a copy of Settlers Catan. And then from there, I got a big stack of old Avalon Hill games from my uncle, which we gleefully played, though we did not know the rules. And so all through middle school and high school, it was an activity that was done constantly and almost without thought. If it was rainy outside, like we were going to be playing a board game inside. It wasn't even a conscious hobby. I just assumed kind of every family was like that. I didn't, when you're a kid, you don't really have a lot of disposable income. So it was usually like one new game a year. And by the end of high school, I had started playing, I think I played like Age of Steam right at the end of high school. That was like an early Walls game. I remember saving up because Princes of Renaissance had like just started to get hard to find. I remember saving up like a birthday and a Christmas to like get a copy of Princes of the Renaissance. And then in college, I was able to get into the heavier games, but I've been playing games since I was really young and always with full tables. It was always easy to find a game.
Wow, that's exciting. That's kind of a different kind of thing that led you into the hobby than a lot of people, and definitely a different starting point, getting some of those early, really complicated Avalon Hill games and just messing around with them to get kind of just involved to begin with. But then right away, almost from like your very beginning stages of gaming, those heavier style games kind of were your bases. And so that's something that, I found myself involved with, but I kind of started at how most people do, gateway games that led me into the heavier side of board gaming. So what kind of was the draw? You saved up for Age of Steam and Princes of the Renaissance and stuff like that from an early age. And so what kind of led you, what was the draw to those heavier games? What was that thing that kind of grabbed you in that heavier style of game that really kind of made you stop and take a look and go, oh, wow, this is kind of the more avenue I'd rather take, as opposed to maybe something that was a little bit lighter, like following the Catan path?
Right. Well, this is a tricky question because for a lot of people, I think now I'm 30, I've got kids and a job, and now the choice to play heavy games because of the demands of the time and learning the games and corralling the people, I think there are more barriers to playing heavy games now than when I was in high school. When I was growing up, I think it had its origins in something like the impulse, like a narrative impulse. We wanted the biggest, grandest stories that we could tell. And a component that I didn't mention is I've got a copy of the 2nd edition of Twilight Imperium sometime in middle school. It was at a hobby shop. And we played it a ton. We loved that game. And I remember that Fantasy Flight game, the 3rd edition of that game, and the Game of Thrones game, we play this is the board game. Those were played with like a startling regularity. Like we play them 2 or 3 times a week in the way that, these days I might play like a MOBA or StarCraft matches a few times a week. When I was a kid, like we were playing a lot of Game of Thrones, and it was just with the neighborhood kids. So the games were fast. We had an established meta about them. but I don't think I ever made. I think partly, actually, I'll put a corrective on that. Part of the reason I was drawn to the heavier games is because I could more easily. I think I was somewhat immature in how I thought about like modeling a conflict or a story. Because I
Hmm.
remember playing. I remember not understanding diplomacy because of the rule that only one unit could be in one like country. One I can't remember what they're called, provinces maybe. And I love diplomacy now, but I remember in high school learning how to play it and being like, this is nonsense. Like I'm going to house rule this game and fix it because you should be able to have two armies in a spot. And so like the heavier games, because they were closer to like a one-to-one understanding of how I thought about a problem or I thought about a story, they were more appealing.
Hmm.
And we didn't worry about the time constraints and the difficulty of the rules because it wasn't. I mean, a lot of my peers and I played Dungeons and Dragons too, but Dungeons and Dragons is so much more complicated
Hmm.
than the most complicated board game that we never really thought of the games as like consciously complicated. And then when I got to college and started building a new group, I went to Indiana University in Bloomington, and when I was starting to build a new game group, I ran into the problem of how do I teach someone how to play Game of Thrones when they have maybe only played Monopoly once at like their grandparents' lake cottage. And
Hmm.
so for me, like the heaviness of the game was never something that I was conscious of. I think now it's interesting. I mean, especially with like the heavy cardboard guys and a lot of the work that you're doing, there's this idea like of weights in games, and you kind of like as if you're lifting, right? You're like building yourself up to a bigger press, and it's more of an event, right? We're gonna play Arkwright, and you're gonna read the rules before you get there. And we're gonna like set it up, and it's an
Hmm.
event. And that wasn't like I recognize that's an important force, and it's one that I mean I can't play Here I Stand every day because it just requires too much. So I understand it, but as a kid, I had no like realization that I was going into the heavier game. I just was looking for games that seemed interesting, and in my like 16-year-old mind, those were sort of space opera, fantasy, history type games.
Hmm.
So yeah, I almost couldn't help but be drawn to the really big box things I could get my hands on.
Yeah, and that's kind of interesting. One of the things that you had mentioned in there is you said that some of the games that you began to play, you started looking at kind of the rule sets and tweaking them and house ruling stuff. And do you feel that like from the early stages of your gaming, that kind of game design was something that was kind of a path that you were kind of being kind of led into almost subconsciously, that you were kind of that game design mentality was something that was kind of implanted in you and something that was kind of under the surface even before you started designing games?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I learned, I remember getting squad leader, and we tried to learn how to play it, but I was so young. I mean, we were just, I mean, I don't imagine that we had played anything like what squad leader is. Uh, so we were house ruling and sort of inventing a system of rules for it. And then actually, Twilight Imperium is interesting because I played the second edition a lot, and I was so excited for it. And I remember playing that game regularly, and there was a feeling. I think that this is sometimes missed because Twilight has become this like institution of a game. But when it came out, so many people were very mad because it's so different from the second edition and is worse in a lot of ways.
Okay.
Like just, I mean, Twilight Imperium is a remarkable game, but from the standpoint of the quality of the design, like if you could play it in a tournament atmosphere or something, Twilight Third Imperium, the third edition of the game has problems that the second edition didn't have, and I remember we aggressively house ruled it, and we were constantly tinkering with that design, myself and my brother and our friends. And I think I maybe took the lead on some of the tinkering just because I was the person who owned the copy. But by the time that we were playing that game regularly, and by the time I put it in the back of the car to take it to college, it was not recognizably Twilight Imperium.
Mm.
And in fact, one of the frustrations I have with that particular game is every group is playing by their different like cocktail of house rules to the point
Right.
that what do we mean? Like, what do we mean when we talk about Twilight Imperium? Well, because it's a fractured game. And so I went from a place in college, I was always house ruling. And there's a group in Bloomington that did a lot of playtesting for Fantasy Flight games. And so they were always tinkering and like adjusting the numbers on Battlestar Galactica. And so I used to really relish that. And then when I realized that it was actually stopping me from playing the game, I started disliking the impulse to house rule, even though it was very important for me. I felt like it was destroying the game because you couldn't talk about it anymore.
Hmm.
If that makes sense. But I do think that, like, from a pretty early age, playing games and designing games were inseparable parts of the hobby. Like, if you were playing the game, you were thinking about the design.
Hmm.
And I also think that that's the arrogance of children, right? Like when you were a kid, you're like, oh, you know what would be better if there were lasers in this game? What if I had a chess piece that shot lasers? And you just kind of like use that to, that's the
I
spark.
completely understand what you mean. It's almost like you can't even help. Just like when you like a particular mechanic a certain way, even when you get a game that does that same mechanic a different way, you want to instinctually be like, let me tweak it to this one way I like to do this better to see if I would prefer the game that way. And so that's just even in small aspect stuff that I think everybody does in their games, you know? Um, well, this is a question I really like to ask people when we get going. But what was kind of that first game that really kind of gripped you? And I know you started playing games at an early age, and you started playing some very good games at an early age. But what was the first game that really, I mean, it really sunk its teeth into you and grabbed you? It kind of made you stop and go, "Wow, this is incredible!" Like, kind of put that, bug in your brain that just made you think about it for days afterwards. What was that game that really did that for you?
Oh, this is such a good question because I think there were a couple. I hate to bifurcate it, but like I think that there were a couple games that did it there because I've been playing games for a while and because it was just a pastime. There was a moment, I think when I was a sophomore, or maybe the summer after my freshman year in college, where there were a couple games that I played that made me want to think about games as more than a pastime. One of them was Titan, the old Avalon Hill game, which had such a mystique about it because you couldn't find it. It would go for like $200 on eBay. But I remember playing it on the little Java program and learning the rules and playing the Avalon Hill version. And I'd never played a game where the different systems in that game, they felt beautiful. Like the way Titan works, all the little elements in that game, it's such a tight mathematical model. And the way, like once you start really mapping the probabilities and the way the stats and the combat works, it's just such a perfect, it's like as hard as a diamond. I can think of no other game that's like it. And it was that game and Age of Steam,
Mm.
where, and El Grande to a smaller degree, but I remember both with Titan and Age of Steam, we learned how to play those games, and then I wanted nothing more than just to keep playing those games. And we would play 2 or 3 games of Age of Steam like in a sitting. We'd just get together and we'd play it, and then because we didn't have anything to do, we'd say, "All right, we're gonna like play it again right now on this on the floor of my dorm," because there was something. There was something about those games that is so unforgiving, but it's just like a harsh teacher or something, where you would get punished for thinking poorly. Procedural, like sometimes I feel again a Feld, not to hit Feld, but it fell a little bit. If I don't manage my conversion very well in a Feld game, like something like Terra Mystica, I don't feel like I am in awe of the game's brilliance. I feel like I made a clerical error.
Mm-hmm.
But in Age of Steam, you like the difference between a bit of 5 and a bit of 6 could crush you. And it was those hard edges that appealed to both games.
Okay. Well, I'm going to ask you something here that's going to be kind of interesting. So, with you getting that kind of excitement and drive out of Age of Steam and being interested in game design, there are quite a few game designers that cut their teeth making Age of Steam maps. I mean, that's been a lot of people's entry point into game design as a whole, is making Age of Steam maps. Now, let me ask you something. Has that ever been something that you've considered, that you've thought about, or even perhaps something that you've just kind of filled with in the background? Or could we maybe possibly expect to see a Cole Wehrle Age of Steam map in the future?
I have never made an Age of Steam map. I tried once, and it was so much harder than I expected it was going to be. I mean, it's funny because you look at the maps, and they have, if you were to look at like 50 maps, they have a kind of generic similarity, right? There are cities, the grass is green. But in terms of getting it right, I mean, it was, I tried to make one that was just a map of Indiana. And it boggled me, and it did not work. And it was so frustrating to play a game to like figure out what the average distances was between the cities, get a sense of the logic that was informing the map, build essentially a copycat of the Rust Belt map, and then have it not work. And so I think I never felt a desire to build scenarios for Age of Steam just because I found the design of the existing maps to be so good and to be so intimidatingly good. I mean, we would play the Ireland map. I think it was the Ireland map and what's the other one? The North Korea map. Those got tons of play. The North Korea map is the one where the cities change color as goods move through them. And then the Ireland map is very small and poor, and in a way that usually the Irish experience the game. It's sort of like 1849 or something, where you're just playing on kind of a constricted place. I would love to build one. I do not have a group that would let me test an Age of Steam map right now, sadly.
Oh man, that's a shame. I was hoping to get the scoop, and you were going to be like, "I've actually got an Age of Steam map ready to go."
But also, there's a problem with the world of Age of Steam maps, which kills me, which is the iterations of those games. I think it's a very badly managed IP on Wallace's part, because the iterations, the like Railways of the World, the Steam, and some of the other things, they really hurt the Age of Steam player base by fracturing it.
I can see that.
So I think that like probably generally it's expanded, and games today are not what games were like in 2004, but I think that the idea that you could play like a slightly light or slightly medium variety, like all the varieties of Age of Steam, like fractured that player base. And so I don't know what an audience would be like. I don't know if there's an audience for a weird Age of Steam map.
I mean, Albin Viard has been making them for quite a while, and I mean, he sells them. I mean, it's not a huge market, but then you're dealing in stuff that's very niche for like a Sierra Madre, which I would even assume is much more niche than what the Age of Steam map market might be. So it's
I would guess they're similar sizes.
Yeah. Okay, so here's another one, and just as we're kind of just going back and forth, just talking about games,
sure.
Let me ask you this: currently, right now, do you have a favorite game? Like, do you have a game that's like, this game, hands down, I would play it anytime over anything? Is there a game that you say, this is the game for me?
These are good questions. Favorite game at this moment? It's hard, because if you've asked this question to other people who are designing games, the only thing you want to play is the thing you're working on. It monopolizes you. Like, all I want to do is play John Company. Last night, my wife and I played it a couple times, and afterwards we're like, we should go to bed, we'll read a little bit. And I was like, can we just play like again? Because that's all you get your head stuck in it. But for other games, I'm trying to think like things that have really blown me away recently. So my usual answer for that question is something like if I had players, I would want to be playing Diplomacy constantly. That over the course of college, like that became like one of my favorite games. But that never happens. So usually, or the thing that I always put in my bag, I don't know. These are tricky questions. I would probably say like I'm really intrigued by. I'm playing a lot of 1849, and so I either want to play 1849 or something like Diplomacy.
Okay.
So the favorite in the sense that I'm driven to like get them on the table. It doesn't often happen, sadly, either. But
yeah, unfortunately, sometimes your favorite game is more something that results in I want to play it so badly and can't, which kind of creates the desire, which leads you to wanting to play it more, which leads it to becoming, as you think about it more, your favorite game. And that's kind of almost like a downward spiral of a game becoming your favorite. Is I wish I could play this more. I never get to play it. Therefore, it's my favorite game.
I had that happen to what is my favorite card-driven war game, the Napoleonic Wars, where I had just been thirsty. I wanted to play it so bad because I had a group that played it somewhat frequently. They moved away, and I just said I wanted to play it. And then I had a couple years ago at BGG-Con, I played it I think 3 times in 3 days, and then afterwards like I'm done for a year. And I love that game, but it was like I'd clearly drunk too much from.
Well, here's one last question when it just comes to just general game talk, but not including anything that you're designing currently, but what is the last game that you got to play? Not including John Company or playtesting any other designs, but what is the last game that you got to play?
I played Evolution Climate 2 nights ago.
And what'd you think about that?
I don't know what I think about it. I'm very intrigued. It's very smart. It's a smart game. It's well built. Um, I do not. It inspired a lot of conversation about the design afterwards.
Have
Go ahead.
have you played the original Evolution, not the
I have
Climate?
not. I haven't played the original Evolution.
Because I'd be interested because I played the regular Evolution, and when I got done with it, I said, "Okay, I don't need to play that again," and therefore I haven't been interested in the standalone Climate version of the game either. So, but that's
Well,
interesting that. I might actually look up if I see Climate on the table. I might actually sit down and see if it's more enjoyable than what I found the original base game as.
well, we played it. I mean, this is. I'm lucky to have a body of players that oftentimes we do double and triple headers. It's kind of like
Oh,
my
okay.
one. The one thing that I really emphasize with a group is if the game is intriguing or if we don't know what to think about it, the best time to play it is immediately after finishing it. So
Hmm.
we played Climate and it was interesting. Um, it had things that I liked about it, but it felt like loose and kind of incremental. And as you know from my games, I don't care for games that are incremental. Like I like, give me a you're going to win or lose on this decision that's got meaty and has some real consequence. And Climate felt very incremental. And then the second time we played it right after because everybody was feeling kind of on the fence about it. And the second time we played a lot harder, where we were really trying to maximize our points. And then the game kind of sparked to life a little bit, where it was very much like counter drafting, a lot of like interesting blind bids with the cards, essentially. Um, but I don't know what I think about it. I would play it again. I would give it 2 or 3 more plays. And I think it's a remarkable design for how much it's packing into a very, very light rule set. And so I admire that about it. But it wasn't like BIOS. It didn't feel like BIOS
Gotcha.
Megafauna. And I wondered if they were going to try to do it, but it was more like Yomi than it was BIOS Megafauna. And I think not that isn't to discredit Yomi, which is one of my wife's favorite games.
Well,
But it has this like you are drafting, and then you reveal, and then there's a little bit of a strategic trail the players are leaving.
well, that definitely puts an interesting spin on things that you mentioned that because if a party game company is going to create a game that might in some rough ways feel like BIOS Megafauna, I'd like to see what Phil Eklund would do to design a party game.
Yeah,
So maybe we'll see that in the future. That'd be exciting.
I hope so. I mean, I really want the game that I do after John Company is going to be a lighter game,
Uh-huh.
just because I play a lot of light games. I like light games. I really respect them. But I have tried and just failed at designing them. I think they're very difficult to design well.
I know many
But
designers kind of have said the sentiment many times, but the most the designer that most designers are jealous of is Seiji Kanai, who created
oh
Love
yeah,
Letter because he did more with 16 cards than a lot of people can do with an $80 box of components. And so a lot
yes,
of people have made a lot of designers I've heard echo those sentiments in that if you give me 16 cards and I'm not going to make anything, but this guy made an incredible game out of it. And so I know a lot of people that struggle to really compact design is something that, I mean, I know that like if you gave me 16 cards and said make a game out of this, you're not going to get anything. You could probably give me, every component in the world and I might not be able to make a playable game out of it, but
hmm
still.
and I
Okay.
mean, every game I've done, I should say, has like been under constraint. I find that constraint very generative. Like the box has to weigh this much. Like this is how many things you get, and then the whole game is built around seeing how much mileage I can get out of that constraint. So I like that idea, and I'm actually working. It's very, very, very early stages, but I really want to do a game about the Congress of Vienna that is like a trick taker, and that has almost no components. And it's just a vexing prospect, but
That's interesting.
that that's the summer work.
Cool. All right. Well, I know that you currently have just not finished, but you have just kind of finished up a degree, and so you are in. Is that correct? You're in graduate school or just finished?
I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Texas. I work in the English
Okay.
department. I'm
And
almost
so
done.
okay, yes, and I had just in our brief conversations that we've had back and forth through
Sure.
different means, I've kind of caught glimpses of stuff like that, and I wasn't sure on all of the details. But I know that historical stuff and different, your educational level has kind of led into a lot of that different aspects that kind of has bled through into the game design that you've had. And so just kind of as a process leading into talking about your game design, how has kind of your path through life in pursuing higher education kind of led and bled into your game design career as it's kind of flown together?
Okay, so I think, okay, so designs for me start usually, so I'm really interested in the formal elements of game design. But that's usually not enough to get me interested in making a game.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got kind of like a running list of like things that I don't like about games, right? I feel like anybody who's been playing games it's like at that moment about 10 years into the hobby where you get like a little cynical and bitter where you're like, oh, this is another engine builder. And I try not to do that, but I think I have enough like formal problems with certain types of games. So I'm interested in kind of figuring out those problems and solving them. But then on the other hand, I have this interest in games as a communicative art form. And so when I'm doing research for an article or a chapter, I will find curious arguments and think, oh, there's a way of, like, the best way to represent this argument is with a game. And then if that, so it's like two tumblers, and if that tumbler aligns with the second tumbler of like a curious formal problem, then there's going to be a game design I'm going to start thinking about. So with Pamir, I've been wanting to make a game about the Great Game for a long time because I think it's a fascinating period. It's also, there are no games about it. I still find this like somewhat incredible that there are there's a few war games, but it's such a rich period and there's just nothing. So I thought, okay, I want to make a game about the Great Game. But the problem with that is I'm sensitive to the way people make games about Central Asia and the Middle East and all the kind of Saidian Orientalism stuff. Just the way that if we're talking about, let's say, Baghdad, what springs to mind is Tales of the Arabian Nights. And the way that those kind of thoughts like erase the actual history and people. So I'm sensitive to that, and for that reason, I did not want to make a game about Afghanistan that just regurgitated like all the junk people think they know about Afghanistan. And that actually stopped me from making the game for 2 years or 3 years.
You didn't want to fall into a trope.
Yeah, I didn't want to fall into a trope. And what happened? There were two things that happened. One of them was I was playing a lot of Race for Galaxy, and thinking about how I love that game, but in the tableau builder and the engine builder, as the game continues, the players move away from each other. So the game at the very beginning, you're very sensitive to who's doing what actions, but you're building an engine that's going to make you independent of the other players. Mm-hmm. So most games, like the most interactive and interesting decisions, happen in the first half, and then the back half is just like running the protocol. So I thought, like, okay, what if there was a tableau builder that was also kind of a portfolio game? So like that was the formal problem. Mm-hmm. And then I heard a talk and was reading some books about Afghanistan in the 1820s that led me to think like, oh, the actors aren't the British and the Russians. The actors are these like local political alliances that are manipulating the British and Russians in their own game. Mm-hmm. So like what you need then is not a scenario that it's like the West versus the East, but instead how the different parties, like in the East, so to speak, are surviving and thriving in this new political landscape. And then it struck me that if the players are investing in these European powers, that's the portfolio element. And the tableau builder I'll get through Pax. And the whole game like jumped right out of that. So within it took me 3 years probably to like have that cluster of realizations. But then the game's victory condition was like an hour, and like we had a prototype like the next day.
Well, let me ask you this question, because Pax Pamir, and we'll go ahead and jump right into it. Pax Pamir follows a very similar vein as Pax Porfiriana. They would be considered to most people sister games in a way. And that being said, did you design Pax Pamir on the system of Pax Porfiriana from the get-go, or did it evolve into that system? And kind of what made you take Pax Porfiriana as a game and start to disassemble that? And was that something that you had already had a talk with Phil Eklund about, or is that just something that said, me personally, I'm going to try this and then see what comes out of it?
So I'm gonna get all biographical again. But when I moved to Austin, I lived right by this little game store called Great Hall Games. It's amazing. Sadly, no longer there. But it's a weird game store in the way that few game stores are strange, where they like stocked old, odd, strange games. But they had
I wish I had a game store like that.
And I had there's one in Fort Wayne. Like all the other game stores that have like whatever's recent, whatever's featured on Wheaton's Tabletop. There are still lots of stores like that, but there was a little store in Fort Wayne where I grew up that had weird games, and I found one in Austin, and they had tons of Phil Eklund games. So I hit the Phil Eklund train early. Like High Frontier it was right before High Frontier came out.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember like playing Lords of the Spanish Main one weekend, and then the next weekend just going to the Saturday open gaming group. The next weekend everyone was playing High Frontier. And so when Porfiriana came out, I'd already played Lords of the Sierra Madre and liked it. And then Porfiriana got a lot of play. And the thing that it did is there is so much thought in that box.
Yeah.
Both at like the flavor text level and the crazy collages of the cards, but just the way the game is like is translating history into its mechanics is just lovely. And in the back of the rule book, I've said this before, but in the back of the rule book, there's this like great little picture of Phil with a sombrero where he says, if you have an idea for a Lord's game, like send me an email.
Interesting.
In the first edition rule book. And so I sent him we played that. I got that game in like September, back when Sierra Madre was a little smaller, they could get the Essen game to the people before Essen. And so I got the game in September. We played it for 3 months nonstop. And then I, over Thanksgiving break, made a PAX Renaissance. It's not good. It was a bad game. It was my first attempt to make a game from scratch, more or less. But I gave it to him, and Phil thought it was fun and goofy, and just sort of put me in the PAX Renaissance. Whatever. It was just a little listserv basically, and that was suddenly I had an inside view to how game design worked.
Mm-hmm.
And especially once Matt really took the reins on PAX Renaissance for the better, I kind of went back to this game about Central Asia, and so to answer your question short, I wanted it to be a PAX game, but I also so originally with Pamir there were no player tableaus. There were 3 shared tableaus.
Okay.
Each of the 3 nations. It worked a little differently. But it was built consciously in the PAX vein. And then when I was playtesting Greenland, and I did a lot of playtesting for Greenland, and when that design gelled and stopped changing a bunch, rather when it solidified, when the design gelled, I don't know if I'm using the phrase right. Anyway, when the design stopped changing, I was still in the mood to be working on a project. And over that winter, this is 2 years before Pamir actually came out, we were prototyping and building something like Pax Pamir. But it was always conceived of from the very first moment as being a game for Sierra Madre games. And a game in that vein. So when I was designing the art, I was like, okay, how do the games look? Because I knew Phil was doing it all, right? So, and I wanted the game to get published because I'd never done that before. And so I thought, what's my best chance for publication? I'm going to build a game that's working with one of their systems that looks like the kind of games that he does. The art is going to look like the kind of games that he produces. And so that way he can look at it, and if the game's good, for him it's a low-risk investment. But it was built entirely and I wanted access to his audience.
Gotcha.
That was, to me, the audience thing is important. This is why the Age of Steam map audience for me is a less visible audience, because I don't know where they are and who they are. I'm sure they're out there, but with Phil's games, there were discussion boards. There was a community on BGG. There was a community on Yahoo, and I knew a lot of their names. And I thought, all right, for this crowd, I can make a game.
Oh, that's understandable. Okay, well. And now let me ask you this. So Pax Pamir kind of began as an idea, kind of finalized, and the game came out. And now after that, you released an expansion that added quite a bit to the game, and that was Kyber Knives. And what I wanted to kind of ask you about Kyber Knives was this something that was originally envisioned as a part of the game that got cut out for sake of streamlining or other reasons, or maybe even constraint reasons? And then once Pax Pamir was successful, you were able to kind of release what you would call the full version of the game? Or was Kyber Knives something that after the game came out, you said, you know what would be good? And so I kind of have that question about it, because I've played Pax Pamir and I highly enjoy the game. I call it Pax Porfiriana, but you can teach it in one night. And so I really do enjoy Pax Pamir quite a bit. But Kyber Knives definitely seems like something that might have been originally envisioned to be a part of the box. And for whatever reason, maybe people would be curious as to know why that wasn't originally put in there. Because one thing that I just kind of wanted to put out before you answer the question is, you're not going to make a game like Pax Pamir and intimidate the audience with the amount of content or the amount of rules. You know, Phil Eklund fans aren't going to get Pax Pamir that already includes Kyber Knives and be like, too much, man. And so that's something that I'd like to maybe hear a little bit about.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a good question, and one that I think I struggle with, because we all have tendencies to kind of rewrite our own memory about things. So the short answer is, it was designed with the game, but very early on, just in terms of the deck distribution, if we were only, that box can only hold 120 cards. It's a very, the Premier box is very, just see over your shoulder. It's very small. I can only hold 120 cards. So the idea of including events and the idea of including the capacity cards just wasn't going to happen. So I thought, all right, well, I'm just going to design the game without those things. And then I just have these like notions of other things I'd want to add. So I actually had a card list for a lot of what was in Kyber Knives that was produced very early on, when I was thinking that it was going to be 180 cards. Mm-hmm. Because Porfiriana is a 220 or something. But so I was kind of working like about 200 cards. And then when it was clear there were going to be other pieces and the way the box size had worked, I thought, all right, this is going to get scrapped. So it got cut right away. Mm. So much so that it was kind of isolated from the rest of the game's development. And then as the game was developing, there were things that happened to the design where I would go back to my Kyber Knives document and like make a couple notes of like, oh, this is something I would want to do at some point. The point of the expansion was strange, because after the game came out, so I'm trying to think about the actual numbers here. I think Pamir got played like probably 150 times.
Okay.
Before it came out, which I think, having done Infamous Traffic and now going through the John Company development, seems like the right number of plays. It's kind of a weird like thing to say, but it just, by that point, we really knew it.
Can I ask you a question? Is that 150 plays total, or 150 plays in its near final iteration?
Total, and that's a really important distinction, because Pamir, like I think the version that we sent to the printer, I played 10 times, which is not very much. And I always felt weird about making adjustments to the design and there were adjustments to the design that happened like right at the very end, because you were coming at it with experience, and with more experience in the model than the game. And I think
that makes sense.
Yeah, and we can maybe talk about this if you'd like. I learned a lot about how to use playtesters well, and what they can tell you and what they can't.
Okay. Because
there were so many things that I would put questions to playtesters that in retrospect I could have built a model and could have figured it out on my own. Mm-hmm. And playtesters are very, very critical, but only for certain things about a design. So anyway, having played Pamir all those times, I took a break. So like it got sent to the printers over the summer. I was working on other projects. And then in the fall, as the game was getting ready to come out, I started playing it again. So I thought, okay, I'm going to be teaching this game all the time in the fall. Let's get back into the mode. And as I was playing it, I was realizing that there were all these little things that right, the game was fine, but I wanted there to be like a little bit more of a strategic dimension. I thought, oh, that's what the capability cards are supposed to do. And like, oh, like I kind of wish that we could play with the force pools, right? Because the force pools in Premiere are static. You just get 10 of each cylinder. But I wish that there was some way that they could balloon and decrease. If that was going to be a part of the game. Oh, those are event cards. And so like that got built into the event cards. So most of the things were like there were little rough edges on the design that had actually been kind of solved at a high concept level, but not developed through to the end product. And there were things. So Pamir had an interesting shift where it went from being a full card game to being like a quasi board game.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a crazy moment because Phil, I think he's talked about this in some interview, where he basically said like, okay, Pamir has all these problems, and then Matt was the one who suggested like, what if you were to do it as a board game? And I just like canceled my meetings for a few days and just like worked on it, and completely rewrote the rules. I went through and like totally, and it was a weird moment because, and it's funny because the exact same thing happened to John Company, which we can talk about later, where I just like completely redid it, and it worked. It worked fine. And there were some problems with that transfer to this quasi board game, but they took like 100 plays for me to suss out. Mm-hmm. So with Kyber Knives, it was very much like these were concepts I wanted in the game from the start, but they were also sensitive to a year of playing the game and of seeing its response. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you a very specific example of that. Pamir has a tendency, especially with new players, to lock up when the topples come out. There's just a lot to think about, and you might make the wrong move and like lose everything. Mm-hmm. And I don't mind that because my group is very tolerant to it, and it lessens significantly when you get experience. But I didn't think that was fair to the players because a lot of groups are going to learn the game, and then someone's going to fool's mate them on the first topple, and they're going to put it away, and it may never come out again. And so I was very hesitant to use like a victory point system. But when the expansion came out, I rejuvenated the nation building rules, which is like kind of a strange. You have to win 2 topples. You get points for your influence. Like it basically smooths the game out. Mm-hmm. So if you lose a topple, the winning empire gives victory points to the people who are loyal to it based on the amount of influence they have. In short. And what that did is it kind of like it stretched the drama of the topple over the course of the game instead of like at the moment when the topple appears. And I actually just think it's better. Mm-hmm. And that was something that I couldn't have articulated in May of the year that we sent it to the printers. But having played the game a long time, if there is a second edition of the game, all the expansion stuff will be the default way to play. Right. Because I think it makes the game actually easier to teach and easier to play. And the rules overhead is marginal.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's interesting that the constraint of game design caused you to try to make the game fit into what you needed to make it. But then I'm excited that the full realized version of what you had originally set out to create with Pax Pamir was eventually able to make it to market. And so not to say that Pax Pamir by itself was not a great game that was not worth buying, but that your full envisioned idea was able to come to realization at the end of that. So just kind of progressing a little bit along, your next game that came out with was An Infamous Traffic. And now An Infamous Traffic is a game that I really loved this last year. And in fact, this Saturday on the podcast, we're going to be doing our top 10 games of 2016, and surprise, surprise, it made it. I won't tell you where on my list, but it was definitely one that I highly enjoyed. And so An Infamous Traffic was kind of your next game. And now in speaking with you, this is something that you've kind of, and especially with John Company, this is kind of a strange, albeit roundabout way of making a trilogy of thematic tied in games. And so maybe kind of go into what led to An Infamous Traffic, and if maybe that idea of a trilogy of games was something that began there. And real quick, before we get started, just kind of explain to everybody what, in case they don't know, An Infamous Traffic is. So,
all right. So An Infamous Traffic is a game, the only game, as far as I can tell, about the Opium Wars, which were a series of wars in the 19th century where the British wanted to trade opium and the Chinese government did not want them to do that. In the game, players play British merchants who are trying to build an industry in the opium trade and also manipulate Chinese politics and British politics to like have the opium wars triggered when they want them to trigger and have the trade be stable. So it's an economic game, but it's one that is, I think, very sensitive to theme and history, and so it's a little more chaotic than the average. It's a little more chaotic and a little meaner than the average economic game. It has a kind of war game sensibility, and it's published by Hollenspiel, which is a little game company in Michigan that has a print-on-demand model, but the games are of pretty good quality because they partner with a local producer. Mm-hmm. And it was designed somewhat by invitation. I had built a version, so I wanted to give the game to Phil, and it was going to be a card game, kind of a trading card game, not a trading card game. That's it. It was going to be a card game that it was going to be sort of like a Race for the Galaxy style card game, engine builder. But I couldn't do it, and then for a while it was going to be an extremely asymmetric 3-player game, where one player played the British, one player played the smugglers, and one player played the Chinese government. Mm-hmm. It turns out there are no asymmetric economic games for good reason, because they're impossible to design. So it's going to be like a coin game, but a business game, and that did not work. And so I had actually just shelved it. For every project that gets as far as something like John Company, I think I usually have 4 like duds. So I have a giant closet that's just like filled with game designs they're just not working as well as they need to be. But what happened was I was working on a magazine article about the Civil War and simulation in games, and it was being edited by Tom Russell, who after that offered me an invitation to submit something. And I said, well, I've got this like half-finished game of the Opium Wars. I don't know if it's very good, but if you want me to develop it, I will. And so over the course of just one summer, and it happened. It was developed because I was visiting with my parents for a lot of the summer, with my young family, and my siblings were there, and they had all these friends. I have siblings who were still in high school, and so I had tons of players, and so we were able to play that game constantly.
Hey kids, how about a game about the Opium Wars?
Oh yeah, they were into it, and so just a shout out to like Pax Pamir very much happened because my brother Drew was living with us in Austin. We offered him a spare bedroom, and we played Pamir every night. And then Infamous Traffic happened because my brother Blake was in the other room, and we were able to just be always working on it. So my family's a pretty important part of the way I do development. But it was a strange development because the game, it's very mean. It's just incredibly mean.
It might be the most cutthroat game I've ever played.
And I was very happy. So you mentioned that I've been working on these games that are kind of about the East India Company and British trade. It was a little bit by accident. It was just a lot of my dissertation has to do with the East India Company. So it's just the language that I'm speaking right now. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to, when I was working on Pamir, I thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool if I talked about the East India Company in these games where Pamir is about the people outside of the company, who are kind of like how they're affected by the company's policies, and Infamous Traffic is about what happens after the company goes away. So the company loses its monopoly, and then here are these like young British firms and go-getters, and then John Company is about the company from the inside out. So it's kind of like the East India Company 3 ways. That's how the series works. But with Infamous Traffic, I was very happy with how the game turned out. I liked everything about the design. But I had no idea if it would sell or if people would like it. And so I gave it to Tom, and I told him, I'm sorry, this game is it's so mean and weird and hard to think about. So if you guys if it needs development, just tell me, and we'll domesticate it. I'll file its teeth down. That's fine. And to my surprise, a week later, he wrote back that they had loved it and they didn't want to really change anything.
Yeah.
So it was the smoothest development process I've ever had.
So to get into it a little bit, in Infamous Traffic, one thing that I wanted to kind of mention about it is that this originally, I don't know, but you had come to some kind of terms where this wasn't going to work for Sierra Madre Games, and to seeking out outside publishing, or not outside publishing, but publishing other than what you had intended it for, and kind of just maybe touch on that real quickly about how that came about and what kind of led to that kind of situation and the Hollandspiel picking it up.
Right. So I had told Phil that I had an idea for him, but then about 3 months later, I had to send him the email that just said like it wasn't going to work in his format. Like, it wasn't working as a card game. That's Phil's bread and butter right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would not have resurrected that game on my own, but it was when Tom asked me to design, when Tom Russell of Hollandspiel asked me to design something, it just sort of became the summer project. So it was very much done by request, not exactly a commission, but something almost like it.
Okay.
And it was a good arrangement. The nice thing about, again, there was a production constraint because Tom said, look, like I've got this new company. We're going to start in the fall. We want like at least one young designer to be in our like initial lineup. But here's the thing. It has to have 178 counters. So you get a board and you get a counter sheet. And you can have some dice or some cubes, but I had to kind of like fight for those a little bit. And I had never designed a game with counters. And so I took a card game and was like, all right, so I've got 178 pieces, and then spent some time thinking about how those get divided. Mm-hmm. But it was built almost entirely from the production constraint of Hollandspiel. Like when they decided how many counters they were going to be able to laser cut, they decided the design of that game.
Interesting. That's fascinating. The way that began as something and transformed into something completely different by the end of it, but something that you, like you said, you're very happy and satisfied with what the result was. And again, you had mentioned that you weren't sure where the audience was going to be for this game or if one would exist. And I know that in an interview that Low Player Count did with Hollandspiel, they had mentioned that they were wildly surprised at the success of an Infamous Traffic. And granted, I don't think an Infamous Traffic is going to be the next Agricola and do something like that. But at the same time, from what a lot of people, yours and Hollandspiel's kind of were, that this game kind of surpassed that in a big way. And I think that rising tide that the hobby is experiencing with people that are into heavy gaming and people like especially heavy cardboard, but even like we're trying to do and kind of lift up that edge of the market to give kind of people more of a platform to stand on into a media presence. I know Pax Pamir fan, and as kind of a fan of yours, when I heard about an Infamous Traffic, I mean, I was retweeting it as much as I could and talking about it everywhere that I could leading up to the pre-orders and everything like that. And man, I was glad that when it came out, I was excited about what the game was and how it turned out. And so that's really interesting. And I'm glad that was able to happen for you.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's I was going to go into something else. So real quick, if you want to make a comment on that.
I was going to say that I think this is something I really like about working kind of on the margins like this, because the hobby is experiencing this kind of rising tide, as you describe it. There's a place for, we can call it like the Eklund School of Design, like the very thematic and strange. And it doesn't necessarily fit into a like heavier light paradigm, but there is a place, and it's being built in part because people like you are willing to like retweet about it. I mean, it's funny you mentioned Twitter. I got a Twitter years ago, never used it because I didn't know what to use it for, and now I use it for games.
Yeah,
and it's such a lovely place for those kinds of conversations and for building that kind of community up.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm just, man, the community that gathers around, and that's kind of the impetus of our podcast, is we wanted to create a bigger and broader community for heavy games. And that's why the Deep End exists. That's what our entire goal of our podcast is. And what we set out to do is we want a community that bases itself around these heavier games, or these, even if not heavier, these more niche games. And so that's kind of where we stand as well. So we're going to kind of leave an Infamous Traffic, although I'd love to be able to talk about it a lot more, but we're going to kind of lead into something that I'm sure most people that are listening to this are going to be most excited to hear about. And that is the upcoming game, John Company, that has kind of been on a lot of people's minds. I know it was my #1 most anticipated game of the year when we did our list for that, and I can't tell you how pumped I am for this game. John Company just seems like something that is going to just I'm excited about it. And I just want to kind of just turn the reins over to you for you to kind of talk about what it is, but not only what it is, where it's coming from, and where you're at in the process with it. So,
okay. Let's see if I can sort through where should I start. Oh, so this game, this is the game that I've wanted to make for the longest since like the beginning of my thinking about it.
So can we go ahead and say right now, this is going to be your magnum opus?
Oh, easily.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading Keeley's book on the East India Company when I was an undergraduate and being completely compelled by it, but also, so I have this weird relationship with the East India Company because they are the Bête Noire. I mean, they're the villain, right, of basically any history. Certainly, like from the post-colonial perspective, but even within the period, the Victorians like couldn't stand the East India Company.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go into the history of the East India Company, it's so complicated. This massive institution, you've got hundreds of interested parties and little factions and all this bickering, and it produced policy that was incoherent. And so every time I tried to build a design around it, or even teach it in a class, I couldn't say anything about it because, like, were they marauding imperialists? Well, there was a military-industrial complex that was, but the traders hated those people, and the traders were the people piloting most of the company. So it took me a long time, and actually, I think it was after Pamir, shortly after Pamir finished, I started thinking about how, and actually, this is when I was struggling with infamous traffic. I thought, okay, what if the incoherence of the company isn't a barrier to design? Like, what if it is the design? And as soon as I had that thought, everything about the game started making sense. Where I started thinking about, and my general, like my guiding lights in this has been, what if Republic of Rome were a business game? Where the different factions in Republic of Rome, where everybody has these factions of senators, instead of guiding a state, what if they were guiding like a company?
Interesting.
And I love Republic of Rome, but I also think it's not a good design. It's brilliant, but it's not good because the world of Republic of Rome like isn't organic. It's just a deck that like flips cards, and the status of like what it means for Rome to do well or do poorly is like very binary. And if Rome does poorly, like the game just shuts down. And so I started thinking about like, okay, can I do a corrective on Republic of Rome where if the company is making a ton of money, the game will have a certain character. If the company is broke and like on the ropes, the game will have a different character. But it will still like work as an engine. And what if like instead of just you knocked off the Carthaginians, like instead of just that kind of like there's a threat, we push it away. There's a threat, we push it away. Instead of that, like what if the landscape that the company is operating in is like a little more organic and seems to be breathing? And so those were the core thoughts that were motivating the game, right? Like what if somehow like there was a business game where the business is like being operated collectively by the players? And the design festered for a long time. It actually so infamous traffic, one thing we didn't mention is how the game is entirely built around the accumulation of social and cultural capital. It's like everything you're doing, you are trying to get like the fancy hat or the nice college degree or like the nice country estate. And I stole that with accreditation, but I stole entirely from Splatter's Greed Incorporated, which I thought was one of the best business games ever made. In part because they understood that you can't grasp the world of business without thinking about what is the engine that is making people, create subprime mortgages or something. They want to buy the fancy car, fancy painting, there's a rat race that is then forming the rat race. As soon as I had that, I thought, okay, I've got my victory condition, which I usually start from the victory condition and build out. And so John Company has more or less the same victory condition as Infamous Traffic. It's about cashing out. Infamous Traffic is a little cruel and random. It's not that random, but it is cruel in how that cash out works. John Company is a little more incremental because the design needs to be. But that's just kind of a brief overview. So it's a game that I've been working on I've been thinking about for a really long time. Mm-hmm. And the development, Infamous Traffic was a much easier game to develop than Pamir. Because with Pamir, I didn't really know what I was doing. I was managing a lot of playtesting groups. I was just kind of like wandering in the dark. With Infamous Traffic, I knew what I was doing. I still made mistakes, but I knew what I was doing. With John Company, at least from the development side, it has gone very smoothly.
Wow.
It's almost gone like too smoothly. It makes me uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah. But man, that's exciting. That's really, really exciting to hear about how that process has come along and how John Company's kind of really taking shape. Now, real quick, a little bit of some technical aspects I want to ask you about the game, just so people can get more of a firmer standing and less kind of a heady viewpoint of it. But the game, as it stands right now, would you classify it more into the card game status, or kind of in the Pamir vein, or is this going to be more of an economic style game?
Okay, so it was a card game for a very long time, but it was a card game where no cards were ever shuffled and there were no hands. And in the course of development, and I alluded to this earlier, in the course of development, we had a moment where my brother and a couple of people he was playing with, they wrote me this email that said, actually, this should be a board game. And so I totally changed it. I rewrote the rules and redid the graphics, and I made it into a board game. Or rather, I redid the graphics. I didn't rewrite the rules. What was surprising is I turned it from a card game to a board game, and I changed 2 rules.
So I just want to.
It's a board game.
So I just want to mention something real quick. So Pax Pamir started as a card game. Somebody said it should be a board game, and then that kind of was the spark you needed. And Infamous Traffic started as a card game. Somebody said, "Oh, this needs to be a board game," and you said, "Oh, that makes sense." And John Company, the exact same thing. So I'm going to say, I think that your heart's desire is to make a card game, but you're physically incapable of doing so. Would you say that that's accurate?
I think that is a completely accurate statement. The what got me on John Company is Republic of Rome. I was just thinking about Republic of Rome, which is essentially, it's sort of a board game, but like there's a lot of cards and you're moving the little things around. But the problem with that is it's very hard to visualize the company. So if you imagine, okay, so I usually describe with Food Chain. You've played Food Chain Magnate.
Yes.
Okay, so in Food Chain Magnate, imagine a late stage company where instead of all of the jobs are being in one person's company, you divide those jobs among everybody.
Okay.
And so everybody has a little row of jobs, and then when the company operates, you are responsible for doing your jobs.
Got it. Wow.
That seems to make sense as a card game.
I can't tell you how I can't tell you how you just saying that is incredibly exciting. Like that, I mean, you're really kind of twisting the screws.
Yeah. So I was thinking about it in the same, because I played a lot of Food Chain and was like, all right, it should be cards. But what that didn't tell me is that there's this problem where you can't really see how a company is doing when its jobs are in front of 4 or 5 people.
Mm-hmm.
So we would do experiments where we'd put the jobs in the middle of the table, and we were almost just building the board and how the board works.
Got it.
It's also hard because the company doesn't have a single treasury.
Mm-hmm.
When the company makes money, the chairman takes all the money that was made and divides it among the offices and budgets it. And then if it's not enough money, then they get screwed. If you want to give preference to your own people or people that you have connections with, and figuring out looking at the board and being is the company doing well was impossible unless you were really familiar with the game. As soon as we switched to a board, and I sent a very crappy, I drew it in an hour board to my playtesters, and that night when I got the reports back, they're like, "Oh, this is so much easier."
Yeah.
And what it was when you have tableaus in front of you. All of the work of the game is happening in players' heads. And for a designer, because you're very familiar with those structures, it doesn't seem like a big tax. But by laying it out and by putting all the charts and all the numbers like on a board, you are giving the players, like, you're just lifting the cognitive load from the players. So this is similar to Pamir, because in Pamir, especially when you're like tracking the influence and everything, it's a lot to hold in your head. And just allow it, like, doing what you can to make it so the players can focus on the story and on their own strategies, and not just trying to put their hands on the game itself. I'm interested in like the cognitive ergonomics of design, and so I wanted to make it a little easier for players to just exist in the world of the game.
Right. And so really just trying to get some more of the solid informational aspects
Sure.
of the game down. Would you consider this a heavier game than your previous two designs? And I would say that your previous two designs, while Pax Pamir different than Porphyriana, but very much in the same vein, I would consider it but incredibly deep. Whereas, or I maybe not rules light, but a little bit of a bulky rules overhead, but then afterwards kind of a depth of gameplay. Whereas an Infamous Traffic is very simplistic gameplay, but very opaque strategy. Where would you kind of classify this in a weight scale among games? Because I know a lot of people that like Eklund games, they enjoy a heavier style of game. And so I just kind of wanted to get your thought process on where this might kind of stand weight-wise as compared to other economic games.
So I would say, in terms of the rules are currently 8,000 words, which is PAX Renaissance.
Okay.
It is, however.
And does that include fluff text? Because
no, it does not.
Okay.
I think Renaissance might be a little longer if you include the footnotes.
Because when you talk about a Sierra Madre game, rules and fluff text are kind of conjoined into a thing that it's hard to separate out.
My rules, the rules document itself is like 10,000, but I have a long essay and there's other.
Right. Okay.
So despite the fact that the rules on the longer side, they are written a little more conversationally.
Okay.
And the game is actually designed to be very accessible. Now, it's not a light game. It's a heavy game that is going to be accessible. One of my projects this summer is going to be to make a really good teaching video, because I think I can teach John Company in 10 minutes.
Wow.
Just the basic. And then there's a lot like humming underneath the surface. So you don't get all of the rules, but you get enough that if one player knows the rules well, they should be able to teach it in about 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay.
And then you skip certain parts of the game. Because the one thing I'll say about it is I think it's very accessible. It's the first game I've made that my wife really likes. She likes heavy games. She just usually doesn't like the games that I make. But this one, she really enjoys, and I think we would put it. I would say it's in the Porphyriana camp. Like, it's probably a step harder than Greenland, but less exceptions. So many less exceptions.
Okay.
It's a lot cleaner. Now, once you strip that, like, if we're not talking about rules overhead, it's heavy.
Yeah.
It's on the heavier side. I actually think that, now this is heresy, I'm going to regret this when the game comes out and flops or something, but I think it's heavier than like Republic of Rome in terms of the depth of what you're actually doing.
Okay.
So it is, in terms of just like the core mechanics with none of the jargony stuff, it is it's a business game, so you're thinking about budgets, expenses, but it's a business game that is about risk. And so, 18th century trade was a risky affair, so you're going to roll there's a ton of dice in this game. But because it's a company, that risk, just like the joint stock companies of that period, they mitigate the risk. So like, you roll a lot of dice, but you're often rolling them for the company.
Got it. Okay.
And so like, the company does well, certain things happen, the company doesn't do well, so you can kind of like hedge your bets a little bit. So it's a business game. It involves risk, expenses, growth. It's a political game in that it's kind of a worker placement game where, you're the chairman, so you get to hire people. And so when the jobs vacate, You get to decide who gets it. So it's political. It has a negotiation component with binding negotiations. It's very important that they're binding. And there's a method for tracking money that you owe to people. So like that's the form it's working in. And the weird thing about the game, the thing I am most satisfied with from a design standpoint, but I don't know how the market is going to react to it, is so I mentioned at the very head of this interview that all my games have kind of like weird formal elements. But I didn't mention John Company's, and that is because it's really strange. So in John Company, in every game I've ever played, you control the rate of conversion to victory points.
Okay.
You always control it, right? Like, I'm going to start shipping in Puerto Rico or whatever. In John Company, you don't. What happens is people randomly retire from the company, and when you retire from the company, you can score those cubes. And so you don't control how fast you're cashing out things. There are things you can do to influence those numbers, of course. But what that means is, your guy retires. It might be 2 or 3 turns before you get a chance to score, and you don't have money for like a fancy house. So you start getting loans from other players. And so the cash scarcity, like the company is mitigating risk and the other players are mitigating risk.
So let me just kind of stop you right here, and I want to interject with something really quick. And what I want to say is, anybody that's listening to this interview that has any kind of an inkling of game, their excitement over games peaks in the way that mine does. If they're not frothing at the mouth right now over the prospects of this game, I mean, seriously, I have no idea what to say to that, because this game sounds incredible. I mean, this game sounds like exactly what I want. And so, man, I am thrilled about what's going on. So, 2 more real quick things about John Company that I wanted to get at is, where are you at in the iteration process? How final is what you're doing right now?
So the design is pretty done. It's been a long time since I've made any like significant changes to the design.
Okay.
I always think of like big version numbers and small version numbers. We're doing small stuff. So I'm like playing with plus or minus 1 or 2 on like some of the conversion charts. There are some of the powers that I'm like playing with a little bit. So it's pretty far along. The one thing that I don't know if I've said publicly, I'll say it now. This is a good thing to know. So this game is huge. It's like really big in terms of what it can represent. And one of the things, so I mentioned that all the players are working like under the company. One of the things that can happen is there are laws, kind of like old school Renaissance, or not Renaissance. What is that game that has funny laws? Oh, Twilight. There are laws that can be passed and get debated that kind of change how the game works.
Okay.
But one of those laws is the revoking of the company monopoly, which strips the company of all of its commercial powers, and then players, if they want, can start trading firms and essentially play as like mini companies, and they can get investors.
You need to stop. Oh, wow.
I know. So like imagine like one of the things about it is that the company starts with a quantity of money, let's say 25. Players start with $5. So like they don't have enough money to trade and survive by themselves. So they can form little joint stock companies among themselves, and there are different ways they work. Anyway, so what I'm doing now, all this long way to say that the design is set. It's pretty much done. What's happening now is there are different scenarios. So like the ideal way to play the game is there's like an early company scenario that like it's great, and I that's probably my favorite scenario right now. But once you get good at it, the next scenario you play is it begins right when the company loses its monopoly, and then you can go back to the early company scenario and play it at the full length, where the revoked monopoly card is like in the deck. So players can know if they want, they can like kind of posture themselves for like stripping the company of its monopoly. Because I really want the game to go from 1707 to like 1857. Like I want that 150 years, which means you need to be able to talk about a company that is commercial, and then commercial and political, and then just political. And the game should take you through that entire arc. So all that is just to say, that's kind of a separate game. And my developer, Ches Threlkeld, we were talking about it last night, and he was like, God, he's like, I almost feel like we should put this in an expansion or something, because it's about 1,500 words added to the rules. So like the rules themselves are probably like 6,000,
Hmm.
and then there's this other like 1,500 that is how to play the totally different game when the company loses its monopoly. But because I like that game so much, and it's built into the core of the game.
It's a thing that can
I,
happen.
yeah, it's just it's a thing that can, yeah. Once players get familiar with the game, like they can play. So for instance, I'll give you just an idea. Like I could be investing in ships, and those ships, the company gets to move around. Like I got my little cube on the little ship piece, but the company's deciding where they trade and how they work. But when the company loses monopoly, I get all my ships. So the people who own a lot of ships or who own a lot of factories, like they might be lobbying. The people who are cash rich, right? So the thing will happen where certain players will go out in the lead, and so they've got all the respectability, but they've got no money.
Hmm.
And so those people want to keep the company in power because it tightens like it tightens the channel for how to get victory points.
Hmm.
But players with a lot of money are going to want to open that up so more people can get victory points. So all that's to say that in terms of the design, Phil loved it. It's unless something happens, it will probably be a 2017 release. Probably we still have some work to do on it.
So it will be a Sierra Madre game, because that was one of the questions I was going
Yes,
to ask.
yeah. So Phil, Phil asked me to like hold it for him, and he liked it. And assuming everything goes well, it'll be for an Essen release. That there are lots of things that go into that, but I would say I can say with a fair confidence that should be what happens. Nothing like an official announcement, but just that's the hope.
Yeah.
We're designing with that in mind. What will probably happen in the next couple weeks, I will probably open up the testing to anybody who wants to help. I've been very careful about testing because with Pamir, it was anybody who wanted to test could test. And I met great people that way, but it wasn't useful. And for John Company, a lot of the elements of the design have been modeled extensively. We use lots of Python scripts. There's a lot of math happening right behind the board. And what that's meant is what I need from playtesters is ergonomics, like rules help, some game breaking.
Hmm.
But I don't need that much of it. So what I'll probably do is say if anybody wants to play the game, I'm looking for testers who can play it like 5 times so they can get through a lot of the game.
Hmm.
And I'll probably open that up in a couple weeks.
Just get past that first initial impression stage to actually be like, what do you really think of the game? Kind of.
Right. Like ideally I want someone who's going to say they're going to do the early company, they're going to play that again, then they're going to do the post company game, they're going to play that again, and then they'll do the full game. Now,
okay.
from my own reading, when I was looking at the people playing PAX, I knew that the average amount of times PAX gets played is probably 1 or 2. With some groups, like there's a long tail. And so I'm looking right now. I'm looking more for testers who can give it the 5 or 6 plays. But I'll probably put out a call for anybody who wants to help in a couple weeks. And the hope is this month I am working on graphics. I'm hopefully we'll see, but I'm hoping to defend pretty soon. So my schedule is insane.
Yeah.
But I think if I had more time, I could make the game a little prettier. But that's just not going to happen. Yeah. It looks fine enough. But what's going to happen this month is I'm working on the research, the history text, while things are being kind of fine tuned, and I'm spending a lot of time on the privatized company because it's so weird and it needs a little bit more work before it's there. And then we'll do one more testing wave in March, and if everything holds, then it holds, and we're good.
Okay. Well, let me ask you real quick, and this will be the last question about John Company. But just real quick about how long are the game sessions going at this point? Just how long are the games progressing?
So the game is designed to be played in 90 minutes.
Okay.
So a little bit longer than Infamous Traffic, but just about the same length. Now, I know when people play their first game of Infamous Traffic, it's often much longer. I would say for John Company, your first game is going to be 2.5 hours. And then once everybody has played, it will come down sharply. And it's almost similar to something like High Frontier.
Okay.
Where You play the base game. As soon as you can do the base game in 90 minutes, play the expanded game. When you get that down in 90 minutes, add colonization. So the full game of John Company, the campaign game, is about 3 hours long, a
Okay.
little bit longer sometimes. But the tournament game, the standard game, should be a 90-minute, 2-hour game. There are things that can make it a little bit longer, but I've tried to be much more consistent about game length. So
Okay.
you're looking at a heavy game, very thematic, 90 minutes to 3 hours, depending on the scenario.
This is sounding better and better. But that's kind of a lot of information for John Company. So anybody that was wanting to hear more about it,
Yeah.
there you go. That is there's a lot to kind of digest in what we just talked about. But real quick, we'll kind of wrap things up for this interview. But I have a couple of questions that I wanted to kind of get in at the end, and just some things that I wanted to ask you about. Designer, what would you say kind of after what are your kind of goals as a designer? What are you kind of reaching or aspiring to as far as your hopes as what you might want to progress into going forward? And so this
Well,
is not necessarily talking about games, but we're talking about in the abstract.
yeah, I would say, when I love my work, my academic work and my research, but the problem with that is the audience is so small. And when you design a rule book, it needs to be read carefully, more carefully than any article I'll ever publish will ever get read. And so I want to take some of the things that I feel like people should know and just make them accessible. So, there are no good games that talk about the history of the East India Company, and I want John Company to just allow people to be pulled into that history. And if you were working at a historian, or if you're a history major, you might take a class on 19th century Afghanistan. But if you're not that person, you're not going to have a way in. And so I feel like it's an outreach. So I'm always looking for kind of underrepresented themes that I can use as a platform to design a game around. Now that's high-minded abstract stuff. In terms of the games themselves, like, I am interested in working under different constraints. Like, I would love to make a game that was just a deck of cards. I would love to make a game that was more of a typical board game. I think John Company has become that, but a game that had, tiles or something.
So that's the big thing that Cole Wehrle's looking for, is he's looking for tiles. All right.
I would love more tiles in my life.
All right. So I would be definitely not be doing my due diligence as a member of the board gaming media if I did not ask you this question. But we are the board gaming hobby, and we are nothing if we are not impatient. And so we know Sierra Madre seems like a pretty sure thing. So we know we're going to pre-order in June. We're going to get in October. I mean, we know that we know the drill. Okay. But that's John Company. Wehrle, what is kind of, and again, you don't have to mention anything that you don't feel the need to, but if you just want to just mention maybe a project that you've had on the back burner that might be coming up next, or anything that might be kind of leading you to beyond that kind of get excited about, just something that maybe would be something to just let people know, like, hey, John Company's coming out, but there's also this that might be coming around the corner after that.
Yeah, I've got so many things, so many random projects right now. For those who've played Triumph and Tragedy, which I think was my favorite game last year, maybe that was the answer to your question about what you've played right now. Triumph and Tragedy. I love that game. I mentioned I'm interested in working on a game at the Congress of Vienna that is Triumph and Tragedy-esque. It's kind of a lighter card game, but that captures the fear of Triumph and Tragedy, that like terror that you don't know when the war's going to happen. I love that. So I've been thinking about that. That's kind of a summer project, and I have another game for Hollandspiel that I'll be working on this summer. That is about, what can I say about it? It takes place. It is. So I'm working on a game for Hollandspiel that is about a period I have never done anything on, but I'm very interested in. And I think it's going to be a game about a topic that a lot has been written about and a lot of games have been about, but it's approaching the topic from a very different angle but it'll very much be in the Holland Spiel 178 counters vein. So I'm hoping to submit that to them by the end of summer.
Exciting. So that's
Yeah.
some really interesting things that we kind of have on the upcoming. So I kind of put out the question out there into social media about some people to ask some questions for this interview. And I got a couple of responses. And so I've picked out 2 questions that I'm kind of excited and I'd like to hear kind of you get on. But basically, here's a question that I would maybe like to hear a little bit more about. But this is from Andrew Dennison, who is on a podcast called The Good, the Bored, and the Ugly, and he's a huge fan of yours as well. But this is something that he asked, and I'm also very intrigued about this. But would you rather, so this is a would you rather, design a game under tight limits and component limitations, or would you rather be completely unrestrained and unlimited in your designs?
Well, it's funny. I feel like I've offered an answer to this because I do like limitations. But at this moment, I want to work with. I would love to do a game without limitations. I feel
okay.
I like it. I think like in terms of actually finishing things, I feel like I need those production limitations. But I say that with the qualifier that with John Company, I told Phil that like we needed a board, and I told him that I needed all these cubes. And I have had more fun working on that design, which has not had that many limitations. Like it's very much, it looks the way I would want it to look.
Good.
So I think I'm at a place where I want every project to start under the strictest limitations as possible, but then about halfway through the project, I want the ropes completely off.
Okay.
So
okay.
both, Andrew, both.
And so this is another question, and I think this is very interesting. So this is from Tony Crowley. He says, you make games that are fairly complex, but with mechanics that are very much tied to their historical themes. And he said he would imagine that the goal for a lot of your games is historical realism, which could make for an overly complex game. At what point do you decide to cut something out of the game when you decide that you need to abstract the concept more than make it a historically based idea?
That's such a good question. How do I mean, all games are abstract. This is like Phil and I argue about this all the time because for him, the simulation value, like for him, the simulation has a value. And for me, the model has a value that doesn't necessarily like tie to any one thing. I'm trying to think about a place where, okay, this is such a good question. Okay, I can answer it. So I sometimes think about this in terms of scale. So in John Company, every turn is 15 years, about half a generation. And there's a chance that the ships will be destroyed. Just there are things that happen in trade that will lead to the destruction of ships. The destruction rate of ships is completely wrong from a historical perspective because ships lasted more or less like 3 to 6 voyages. They were destroyed all the time. They needed constant like fitting. But within the game, it was too much work to have that much turnover in the resources. And so what I did is I figured out the likelihood of a ship like being destroyed or not completing a voyage. And then when you zoom out on the game, I want that to be reflected over the course of the entire game. So in each turn of John Company, it's 15 game years, but there are 12 turns in the game. And the rate of ship attrition in 15 years is reflected on the game's turn scale of like 12 turns. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So there's like a macro and micro happening at the same level. So I feel like with design, I have a tendency to shift scale. And so if I can't, if my simulation is breaking down, or if I can't show attention at like the time scale, I'll try to find another place in the design to put it. Especially if I feel it's important, like something like ship attrition would be really important. But for me, ultimately, it's about what is contributing to the specific narrative. And if I am making my players count the number of bullets that they're going to need, that counting is taking away from a narrative that I might also be wanting to draw. And so another place, this would be something like this traffic, where the prosecution of the opium wars takes, a minute, 30 seconds to figure out how the opium war goes. Sometimes a little bit longer. But and the reason I did that is because from the perspective is very important. From the perspective of the British firms, they had very little control over how the opium war was actually going. They either had a lot of control or none. And how that looks in the game is those kind of zero-sum game that you play when the opium wars start. So usually when I have a problem, like a modeling problem, or if I have a detail that I can't find a way of putting in, I will ask myself, like, what perspective am I wanting the players to hold, and what kind of controls would that player position have?
Okay.
So kind of a long answer to that question.
Yeah, but that's incredible. And so that's really exciting. And as a fan of your game designs, that definitely seems to see that kind of seeps in from your games from all angles. And so we're really excited about that. But man, this has been a fantastic interview. You've been a fantastic interviewee. And I mean, I was just here to facilitate it. And man, it was just incredible. But I really appreciate you doing this and getting that information out there about your upcoming games and getting people maybe excited about some of the titles that they might have missed out on or not heard about previously. And so maybe they'll be interested to try those out. But real quick, so people can reach out to you, where is the best way to get a hold of you in any kind of way to ask you about any of these games that they might be excited about, or just to get a hold of you? You had mentioned that you're looking for playtesters, whatever you might want to give for information for how to get a hold of you. Where's the best place to do that, and how would they go about it?
So send me a direct message on Twitter, or if you're interested in helping the playtest for John Company, just subscribe to the game page on BGG. I will create a thread, and you'll see it in a couple of weeks. But yeah, I would say I use BGG fairly regularly. These days, like, Twitter is the fastest way to get at me, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions. But yeah, those are the best ways of getting out. This was a great time, Joe. Thanks for letting me gab about my games so much.
Oh no, I am as a huge fan. I was more just kind of like geeking out about getting to just have you on and just talk to you for a little bit and get all excited about some of these games that we're looking forward to seeing. And so this has been the Deep End Podcast and an interview with Cole Wehrle. And so thank you so much for tuning in, and hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.